Welcome back viewers, it's been some time since last video, and even if this one is not a full restart of my channel, this one serves as an update as regarding the news I believe it was necessary. To say that Arctic was at the center of attention for the last week is quite a euphemism between Trump's wanting to get Greenland once again, but also for more exceptional moments such as the sending of troops from different European countries. And even if since Davos Forum the situation has quite de-escalated, tension nonetheless exists around the region. Of course, the main preoccupation here was the sovereignty of Greenland, but in reality it is more about who will get its resources first. And this infighting between Atlantis powers has motivated the different emerging powers such as Russia and China in order to take the lead in the Arctic, as despite their own imperialism, at the moment the US imperialism seems so strong and so world order breaking that one would see any strong partner as a better option. This is another element I think that we can understand from the Davos Forum, with Macron calling for more investment in Europe as the US would seem too unstable. But one major absent country of all this discussion is of course Japan, who was pretty discreet on this issue so far. Yet behind the scene many things are happening in Japanese politics around the region. However, they are severely limited by quite a lot of factors that Japan cannot fight alone. In order to understand such peculiar situation, one must understand a simple concept quite often used in French geopolitics, namely the fleeing forwards. The fleeing forwards describe an attitude of, instead of fighting problems inside the country, major power will instead seek to externalize their problems. And this is the case at the moment for the US, which economic hardship not only leads to a huge dissatisfaction of the current politics, but this same politics also replies by an unprecedented level of political violence against its own citizens. Therefore, a common enemy must be found by the declining power, and in this case it is quite ambiguous on who could it be. It cannot really be Russia, nor China, as a direct confrontation would be too difficult at the moment. Therefore, the only thing found at the moment is to trample on one's allies. That has been seen quite well during the tariff affair, and right now with Greenland, the level of hostility between Atlantis powers is something that wouldn't be expected 4 years ago, when after that Macron declared that the NATO was in cerebral death, that it's currently reviving. And right now we see the same NATO putting soldiers on both sides of an emerging conflict. Therefore, for the US, backing down right now would be seen as a sign of weakness, not only to its own population but also towards rival power in the regions. Therefore, for Japan, there is a quite difficult choice to make at the moment. On one hand, the Japanese diplomacy actively wants to cooperate with the EU, but its attachment to the American allies is pushing it backwards. Not to mention that Russian influence in Japan, even if quite invisible, is extremely present, and several Russian influence deputies are currently running for the upcoming legislative elections. Not to mention that currently the most important topics in Japan are about purchasing powers and inflation rather than an Arctic expedition. But still, as always, Japanese politics is better analyzed on the long term, and as we will see in the next part, Japan hasn't backed down on its Arctic ambition, even though they have been quite discreet in the public debate. In such difficult position, it's expectable to see priorities shifting, even though temporarily. But this is not a sign of Japan completely abandoning its project. And despite the friendliness displayed by Takaichi regarding Trump, it is certain that Japan still has a certain level of agency on its different geopolitics. Still at the moment, and as the common saying says, Japan is walking on eggs, and its diplomacy has to be extremely cautious not to offend the US, as in the US alliance matrix, Japan is probably the most anxious of all allies, and unlike France, Japan does not feel ready for strategic autonomy yet. As I said earlier, Japan hasn't backed down on its Arctic policy. However, the level of information on it is quite limited, and what's available to public is often overinterpreted beyond certain level of sanity. Key element in the recent Japanese Blue Book of Diplomacy is that the suspension of many activities of the Arctic Circle has mostly benefited the private sector, and even if this private sector has received several backlash, especially with Japanese de-investing Yamai oil field, for example, through Mitsui, the private sector is still nonetheless quite invested in the region more than ever, and especially of course for all these resources. Yet, the public power is still major here, as one cannot navigate without powerful ships, the icebreakers, and currently Japan is testing one, the Mirai number 2. And while this ship is not really made to escort shipping containers, it is a valuable asset in the region. The Mirai 2 mission will mostly revolve around exploring the region and independent knowledge of the Arctic in the region. For example, some are believing that the ashes from all these forest fires is actually increasing climate change speed, as the ashes cover the ice sheet, reducing its albedo and therefore increasing the heat conservation. Ambitions are of course fueled by money in our world, and the Japanese Arctic budget didn't move from a single digit this year. And while of course having more budget is always a good thing, for Japan what's reassuring is that this budget won't be reduced in the near future, and that at least Japan can keep its base before more prosperous times. However, something not really mentioned in the document is how this sum will be divided between South and North Pole, as Japan wants to try having cards on both sides of the planet. And for the Arctic, the task will be even more difficult, as since the US is becoming less and less reliable, and that emerging power wants to take its place on even matters such as international rights, Japan is torn out between its wish to collaborate with European allies, but at the same time it wants to cooperate with the US, its closest ally. And since these two types of allies are currently not at the peak of their relation, it is likely that Japan will have to choose should it want to escape this perpetual immobility. As Captain Ishihara said, the battle for Arctic has indeed begun, but it is not a battle that many have expected. While some expected a sort of alliance of Atlantis powers fighting against an emerging bloc of Russia and its allies in the region, this battle is more chaotic than expected, seeing allies getting torn apart by circumstances, while emerging powers seems less and less irrational, becoming more and more legitimate partner despite wars and ambitions. However, this quest for Arctic might be even more detrimental than any profit it could generate, as this attention, these resources, are diverted towards something that can seem as unessential for the most part. This is the same case with AI that gathers more and more resources, while essential industries and services are left behind. To finish, I would like to include more of a mythical aspect of the question, as realism is not the only key of understanding in our world. Arctic and its resources appear as a sort of treasure, well kept and unexploited, something that exaggerates any flaws and divide even the best friends. This is something we find all over fantasy, but my favorite here is of course Tolkien, with the Lord of the Ring and the Silmarillion, where one object that is sometimes less important than the story itself, for the Silmarillion at least, corrupts and leads to the doom of entire nations and people, as these resources, this power, and its accumulation completely drives mad anyone who touches them. This mere folly hasn't been quite studied in international relations, as psychology was of course expelled from the field of serious social science. But still, I think this is an interesting point of view to consider, as despite often coming from grade school, these people taking decisions are still humans in their flesh and blood. This shall be everything for today. I hope to retake more regular videos soon, and in the meantime I encourage you to see my previous video if this is the first time you see me. I hope this was instructive and hope to see you again.